Hi everyone, my name is Leslie Gourlay and I'm a professor at the UCL Institute of Education in London, and I'm delighted to have been invited to take part in this event by the Dignitas Institute of Liberal Education. It looks like a very exciting programme, and so I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to tell you about my recent work and some of the work that I'm continuing to work on and will be publishing on soon. So let's make a start. And as you can see, I have a slide here with a couple of images on it. One of them is a traditional classroom, and the other one is an image of a very digital, rather perfect looking home office situation. And this is a theme that I'm going to be touching on during my talk, because this is part of the current situation we're all facing during the COVID-19 crisis. But I think it also relates to, more broadly, some of the challenges and research questions and indeed theoretical points that I want to touch on through my talk. So my title is The Post-Human University, Texts, Bodies and Materialities. And that actually refers to my recently published book with Bloomsbury Academic, same title. And so I'll be talking about some of the ideas from the book today. So moving on, I want to also mention that my future work and the work I'm currently preparing for will be funded by the Leverhulme Trust, a large charity in the UK. I've received a major research fellowship from them, and I'm going to be working from September on a project called Datafied University, Documentation and Performativity in Digitised Education. So some of the points that I'm going to mention today may touch on that project also. So I'm going to talk first about this image, and you can see it's what you might call a traditional classroom. We have the blackboard and excuse me, we have students, we have somebody sleeping, it seems, in the picture there. And this is a scene that you could see in universities all over the world, schools and universities, except not so much at the moment because of the crisis. And we can compare this with the current situation, certainly in the UK and many countries, where academics and students have been unable to attend the campus and instead they're working at home. And this image comes from a project I was involved in recently called Moving Online. The link is there. Hopefully you can have a look at that. There's a website on the UCL explaining the details about and some of the findings of the project and some of the papers we've been publishing. But one of the really important points coming out of that project was the importance of materiality, particularly the sort of assemblages that people were forced to create in order to continue to work. And the picture is an example from the project taken by a senior professor at UCL who had put it's a table and a smaller table, a box, and then the laptop. The cat has joined him. But the point here is that he had to create this kind of bricolage, this assemblage, in order to be able to work. And it was emergent. You know, this isn't a sort of professional home office, well-organized looking, purpose-built desk like the one we saw at the beginning, but in many situations people are having to improvise in spaces which are actually domestic, not professional. And therefore there's a kind of hybridity to the way that the space is being used. And from the point of view of socio-material analysis, it's very, very complex. As you know, Latour famously argued that the standard paradigm of social science neglects objects. They're not seen as part of the social. But he argues for a recognition of the role of objects to further embody our conception of how we make meaning around text. Well, that's actually my point. And in this case, the physical assemblage which has been put together is in support of creating digital text and interacting with digital text. So although it may look like a very digitally dominated practice, in fact, my argument is that it's not digital. It's an entirely socio-material practice in which the text emerges. And that's one of the kind of crucial points of my book, actually, and what I've been writing about recently. Going back to Sir Catherine Hales, again, I'm sure you're familiar with this text, where she argues that grasping the complex ways in which the timescales of human cognition interact with those of intelligent machines requires a theoretical framework in which objects are seen not as static entities that, once created, remain the same throughout time, but rather are understood as constantly changing assemblages in which inequalities and efficiencies in their operations drive them towards breakdown, disruption, innovation, and change. And I would argue that this Hales's analysis would apply to the context here that I've been looking at, which is, it's not a machine, but it is a material assemblage which is emergent and constantly moving. I would imagine when this academic has finished working for the day that excuse me, he would take down the laptop, put everything back, and maybe the cat would move as well. So it's not a permanent arrangement. It's something which is constantly having to be made and remade, and it's a very complex network of agency in terms of meaning making. So those are some of my opening ideas. I want to think a little bit about another related point coming out of science and technology studies made by Karin Norsteina, excuse me, who talks about objectual practice. And in particular, she challenges the notion that practices are always repetitive and always governed by schemata, that they've got a kind of pattern which just needs to be repeated. And she asked the question of how can we characterize practice in settings where the knowledge base is not static? So she's talking about scientific practice. But again, I want to suggest that this type of analysis of the non-static emergent practice can also be applied to meaning making and textual practices, as I was mentioning before. Excuse me. And she refers back to Reinberger, 97, I'll give the references at the end, making the point that any scientific objects of investigation that are at the center of a research process and are in the process of being materially defined, objects of knowledge are characteristically, she argues, open, question-generating, and complex. They're processes and projections rather than definitive things. Observation and inquiry reveals them by increasing rather than reducing their complexity. So again, she's talking more about scientific experimentation. But it seems to me that this analysis can be applied more broadly. The idea of knowledge being characteristically open, question-generating, complex, constantly unfolding. And she talks a lot in this chapter about the notion of unfolding practice and unfolding ontology. So she mentions the example of a detector in a physics experiment might perform simulations, calculations, drawings, and photographs. So it's got several different functions. But she argues that these are not representations of the function of the detector. She argues that the detector's ontology is multiple and unfolds by what she calls partial objects that are the products of its action. She argues that these boundaries are unfinished. So in her view, what she calls epistemic objects are both meaning producing and practice generating. So there's not what she wants to argue, as I understand it, is that there's not a clear division between meaning making and practice, but the two are interconnected all the time and constantly unfolding. Excuse me. So that is these are my kind of, I suppose, theoretical contentions. And so what I want to argue here is that we can also look at texts as what I call, well, what Norsteina calls, and I would agree with her, as epistemic objects. As with the physics detector, texts are not complete. They're not inert paper objects, and they're not simply images on screens either. I would argue they're not containers, media, or just repositories of information. Instead, they're mobile actors in knowledge practices with permeable edges, with which the practices are constantly unfolding. And this idea is not new. I mean, this point has been made in linguistic ethnography, particularly around the work on text trajectories. I'm thinking about the work of Catherine Kell and others. And so I'm going to mention that, but also I want to relate this to work in social anthropology by Tim Ingold and his idea of the line, and particularly the idea of wayfaring. So I'm trying to combine these ideas together. So Catherine Kell talks about text trajectories in terms of the fact that texts, in her view, have a past. They have connections with people and places and objects in other texts. So they don't exist in isolation. They don't stand still, but they're agentive, fluid entities. And they're acted on, but they also act on the world. So there's an co-constitutive relationship between the text and what we conventionally call context. In my opinion, context is not a helpful term here because it suggests a kind of inert backdrop to semiotic practice. But what Kell has shown us is that in her anthropological fieldwork is that the text is always constantly in interaction with a range of actors. And she doesn't talk about human, non-human, but that would be an analysis you could apply to her work. Drawing on very influential paper from Bauman and Briggs, who talk about the notions of intextualization and contextualization. And they talk about how a given performance is tied to a number of speech events which precede and succeed it. So an adequate analysis of a single performance requires a sensitive ethnographic study of how its form and meaning index a broad range of discourse types, some of which are not framed as performance. And they're talking about speech. But I would argue, excuse me, I've got a slight cold. I would argue that this analysis also applies to text more generally. Lisa Gittelman writes very interestingly about documents. And she reminds us of the etymological source of the word document coming out of Latin for teach or show. She points out, using the same term from Norsetina, that documents are epistemic objects. They're recognizable sites and subjects of interpretation across the disciplines and beyond. Evidential structure in the long history of clues. So she's talking about the way that texts work more within academia itself, but particularly the notion of the document. So connecting up, I've talked about Karen Norsetina's idea about epistemic objects. Also touching on the idea of text trajectories and the way that texts move around. So I'm trying to establish here a kind of what I see as a post-human theorization of textual practice. And in one of the chapters in my book, I bring this together with some of the ideas coming out of Tim Ingold's work. If you haven't already looked at Tim Ingold, I would strongly recommend it. Extremely interesting work coming out of social anthropology with very interesting theoretical strands. Talks about knots and lines. The picture on the front of the book is significant because it represents some of the main ideas. So how does this relate to textual practice? Well, Tim Ingold talks about text as a journey made rather than an object found. So he doesn't refer directly to text trajectory literature, but it seems to me it's the same idea, the idea of the text not as an object or a product or even a repository of information, but as a process, and also set of practices. He argues that reading is not the act of a solitary and isolated intellect, but it's always grounded in sensory immersion of the world. Now, Ingold's really talking actually about paper text, I think, as I understand it. But I think this is also absolutely the case with digital textual engagement, as in the picture that we looked at the beginning with the table and everything. He argues also, similarly to other commentators, that text is always incomplete and always in interaction with the world. So what we see here, I would argue, is a series of different theorists from different traditions and different disciplines making similar points about the nature of textual practice. Ingold very interestingly talks about the notion of wayfaring as a form of movement, which he says is the most fundamental mode by which living beings, both human and non-human, inhabit the earth. By habitation, I do not mean taking one's place in a world which has been prepared in advance for populations that arrive to reside there, he says. The inhabitant is rather one who participates from within the very processes of the world's continual coming into being, and who, in laying a trail of life, contributes to its weave and texture. These lines are typically winding and irregular, yet comprehensively entangled into a close-knit tissue. So he uses a lot of metaphors, excuse me, of weaving, of lines, of threads, knots, this idea that things are emergent in terms of these movements, and that wayfaring, he makes the point that wayfaring is unlike navigation. It's not like having a map and following a map. Wayfaring is a form of coming into being which is emergent rather than predetermined. And it made me think about desire paths. So you may have heard of the notion of desire paths. These are paths which are not planned by the park authority or town planners, but they just emerge because people go to an area and they want to walk a particular way, and the path then emerges over time. But nobody has decided in advance that this path will be in this position. These pictures were taken near my town in England where I live. We went walking there a lot during the lockdown last year, and these are our desire paths. And this is actually a quite famous piece of art, excuse me, by Richard Long, called A Line Made by Walking. And he actually walks up and down in a field for some time in order to make this path himself. But I think the idea is there as well about intentionality and emergence in terms of pathways. Ingold's another really important concept in Ingold is the meshwork. He talks about an entanglement of interwoven lines which may loop or twist around one another and weave in and out. This is what distinguishes the meshwork from the network. The lines of the network are connectors. Each is a relation between points. They lack duration. The network is a spatial construct. However, the meshwork is the idea of movement and growth. There are the lines along which things become. Each animate being, as it threads its way through and among the ways of every other, must perforce improvise a passage, and in doing so, it lays another line. So again, this idea of, it sounds like the same thing as a network, but he's saying it's completely different because it's much more emergent and it's never finished. It's not just connecting points. And he also talks about knots, where many lines of becoming are drawn tightly together, and every line overtakes the knot in which it is tied. The end is always loose, somewhere beyond the knot, where it is groping towards an entanglement with other lines and other knots. Which I think relates to Hales's idea about hyperwriting and the notion of the unpredictability of hyperwriting and what I call hyperreading in my book when we're working with reading online. So I would propose, moving to a conclusion, that a way that we could think about text, in addition to as epistemic objects and also in terms of trans-contextual objects and Kel's analysis, is the idea of knots in a meshwork. Ingold talks about corresponding. How do human actors join in with things around them and correspond to what's happening in improvising passages? What kinds of passages are being improvised as entities thread their way through the ways of others? And meshworking, what lines of movement can be seen? What kinds of knot making? What is going on? How are the lines of movement being redirected? And these are questions posed by Adams and Thompson in their book, Researching Post-Human World, I think the title is. So one of the things I did in the book was I kind of conducted an interview with hyperwriting, where I thought about what the nature of hyperwriting is. And when I talk about hyperwriting, I mean that sense of reading and writing online, and the wayfaring movement that entails. That's just a picture of some of the books that I was working with when I was writing my own book. So I had to wayfare and find a passage, improvise a passage through a lot of these ideas myself. So in my final analysis, I would like to, I've drawn together quite a few ideas here, but one of the things I want to say is that we can have a new meaning of linear. We can make the idea of a meshwork of text and voices. We can use that idea. We can think about a text as a knot, where the writer lines as a verb, it's not really normally a verb, forward, up, around, and back, not a verb in that sense of movement, forming a passage through a landscape, like a wayfarer without a map. So writing as process and also procession. So in conclusion, I want to argue that hyperwriting is mesh-like, where you can go into fall down holes and through hatches. Texts are like tangles of threads. Knots secure the meaning. In contrast with fixed navigation, for example, a virtual learning environment, paths are provided in advance in that case. So it's like the difference between an open forest versus a walled garden. Here's a very beautiful walled garden in Scotland. You can go there, you can walk anywhere you like, but you have to stay on the paths, compared to walking in the wild, in which you can improvise a passage in Ingalls terms. So that's the end of my presentation, 1 minute over. I hope that it gave you some ideas to think about. The references are there, and a full version of this argument is in the book that I mentioned. So thanks again to the organisers for inviting me, and I hope that the day is a huge success.